turning to the text, the example which is usually illustrative of this, one of the things which the proponents of the New South Africa and its constitution often argue is that those of us who suggest that the thing needs to be abolished are underestimating what the Congress Alliance people sometimes call balance of forces. I'm sure you've heard this. But supposedly, the great miracle of the transition was the avoidance of war, the precise subject of my discussion. Now, of course, one can think of war as having been avoided only if one ignores even the statistical data that comes from bodies who collect statistics on death and dying. Everyone knows that this country murders a lot of black people. It is, in fact, a part of South Africa that there's an extremely high murder rate. And one of the interesting things is that the discussion of the statistics of death and dying and other kinds of wanton violence in South Africa usually come with the specification highest rate of murder in a place outside of war, highest rate of rape in a place outside of war. Now, my suggestion is that the error which is made is thinking of us as in a place outside of war. We are at war, and it is precisely because of the ongoing war that this death and dying continues to unfold. It's a structural necessity of this negotiated settlement that this death and dying unfold as it does. But its unfoldment is not chaotic, is not anarchic, but happens according to the logic and structure of racism, which I said the primary function of is precisely to determine rules which pertain to the proper place of death and dying within the society. Now, the example which I make using my utumelo here is that I would say because last year, if I'm not mistaken, the country killed an average of about 27,000 people. It was a higher rate of murder than usual. It's usually approximately 20,000, over the past decade. But last year it was higher. Of these deaths, of course, statistically the breakdown is generally such that about 16,000 of these deaths are the deaths of black men. 3,000 of them are usually our sisters and mothers, and then the other 1,000 is made up of whites and Indian people. And so this is interesting because there are, of course, disciplines even at the university that concern themselves with death and dying. But there are specific violences which are legible within the orders of the university. Under the auspices of gender studies, for instance, there is a construction of what you've heard about femicide and gender-based violence as modes of explication. But the question about the theoretical explication for the death and dying of these 16,000 subsidies is never quite answered and is not subject to disciplining. But the example I always make is if you, student X, let's invent a Xolani, a person of peace, were to die at the university. If you were to die in Mamelodi, I'll say, in a local Pretoria township, the likelihood that your death would make the newspapers and cause catastrophe in the media is very unlikely because there are a considerable number of Xolanis dying all over the country. It is not newsworthy, okay? They say that news is the first draft of history. It is not adequately historical because it is commonplace. It doesn't require a communal consciousness and correction because it is the place of death. It is the fit and proper place of death that it's happening. But if you, Xolani, were to die on the campus of Hatfield, Pretoria main campus, believe you not, there would be media cameras, campus would be shut down, this would be written about, probably across the world. but it will be the same person who has died. The question is, what differentiates your death in Hatfield from your death in Mamelodi? And the point is that your death in Mamelodi is a death in the proper place of dying. You know, within the geography of death of South Africa, this place was formed precisely to produce the labor necessary for the ongoing nature of human life, but also the place where the contradictions and violence necessary to sustain this peaceable order would also happen. And so if you die here, you die in the house of the master, you die in the close proximity to those who are meant for life and living. And so your death threatens the order of things, which needs to be reinscribed by meting out punishment to those who've transgressed this unspoken law, and by making sure that there's accountability, that this is not normal and will not continue to happen. Because if this happens, this is now this is the beginning of anarchy, because the law as it actually is no longer obeyed. That is the real constitution of South Africa, okay? And so this is the point about this concept of race that is much thrown, used, and misunderstood, that its primary and fundamental purpose is to deal and apportion the business of death and dying, okay? Study reveals too many examples that confirm Thomas Hobbes's assertion in the Leviathan book 2, where he states, auctoritas non veritas facit legem, that it is authority or power, force, and not truth that makes law. This is a reply implicitly to the people of the Constitution. War is the father of all and the king of all. He renders some gods and others men. He makes some slaves and others free. That differentiates slaves from the free is war. This is at the foundation of the formation of the state, of the differentiation between freedom and unfreedom. It comes up and, you know, it has eventuated into a school of examining the political, sometimes called realism, but Hobbes falls within this line, you know, of thinking about the nature of original organization. Conquest, you know. Conquest is at the root of the formation of the slave, the colonial subject, and the apartheid subject. The last one is dubious for many different reasons. We have argued in various essays that apartheid itself should be understood as a historiographical subterfuge that in fact conceals the truth about South African history. That the overemphasis and study of apartheid to the exclusion of the historical processes in South Africa produces an exceptionalization of something which had already been happening for a long time in South Africa. A careful study and scrutiny even of the legislative history of apartheid suggests it wasn't even that juridically innovative. Many of the acts which typify its legislative impulses have predecessors in the previous 4 colonies prior to the Union of South Africa. And so one of the functions of apartheid, and apartheid became an emphasized category in the history of South Africa, in the study of South Africa's past, precisely because of the predominance of white thought within the university. If I might place it simplistically, I have an essay called The Liberation of History and the End of South Africa, which I try to make this argument at some length. But the point is that apartheid in the end was a kind of blame it on the Boers. It was a very convenient mode of explanation by English-speaking white South Africa to apportion the blame for white supremacy to the Afrikaners. Actually, Terry Bell wrote an article at some point defending the singing of Dubuli Puno, making the case they're not talking about us. They're talking about those ones. So, you know, we know that this is not hate speech. It's directed at those ones. So, of course, you know, the Azanian traditions, specific explanation to historical explanation is precisely that as long as white supremacy prevails, there can be no good whites. Malcolm X goes further and says the only good white man is a dead one. But the point is that the existence of whites, its political ontology, is unnatural. And if whites had come to South Africa as immigrants rather than conquerors, there would simply no longer be any whites, because they would have been integrated by the overwhelming majority of people. That whites have increased in number ever since their arrival is a fact of politics, not society or nature. It is by design that their numbers have increased exponentially, precisely because of their subjugation of the indigenous conquered people. In fact, one of the preoccupations legislatively of white supremacy in the places where it exists is with assuring the continued and perpetual existence of whites and demarcating, even at the level of the legal order, who whites are and who they are not, how to become white and how not to become white, which deals with the heritage of conquest and how to control its devolution over time. You know that in places where whites conquer and are in the majority, for instance in the United States, where they decimated the indigenous peoples of that territory, white supremacy doesn't create a demarcation and stratification. All who are not white are black. The so-called one-drop rule, because whites do not need to consolidate their power since there's so many of them to divide the spoils of conquest. When whites, on the other hand, dominate a population and arrive as a minority, they need to stratify their power and create subspecies of people. It's all a fiction of white supremacy, this stratification, in order to maintain that dominion over the indigenous people. The mind of Hobbes. Hobbes suggests that the state comes into being through he suggests that in a state of nature, before a legal order is established, men are directed to each other in a state of war. Our theme, a war of all against all, is the condition in which human beings appear. But that the state comes into being through the establishment of a sovereign, which consists in the suspension of this violence between people. So in the state of nature, the only right that one has is the right to violence. If I see your apple and I need to eat, I beat you over the head and take your apple. And you can only stop me if you have the necessary force to do so. And so then we get our armed bandits to deal with this force so we can protect what we have gained from others. But we are, of course, always at the mercy of a stronger force. Macht is recht, and so, as a result of this, people come to a stage of consciousness in which they collectively suspend their violence that they do to each other and establish a sovereign authority who has a monopoly over that violence, which is distributed through a social order, a legal order, courts, the police, so that if I want your apple and I claim it was my apple, we take it to a representative of the sovereign so that you have peace. We suspend the war by keeping the violence there. But Hobbes suggests, of course, this is only one way in which sovereigns emerge. Sovereignty, according to Hobbes, can happen. This is the ideal case, which is, he calls sovereignty by institution, voluntarily suspending violence. He says it's differentiated because sovereignty by institution consisted in the establishment of the sovereign through men's mutual fear of one another. They establish a sovereign. He does, however, distinguish a different kind, more relevant to our historical experience, what he describes as sovereignty by acquisition. This is on the part on conquest, okay? Now, sovereignty by acquisition is different for Hobbes because it is not the mutual fear of one another that causes us to suspend violence against each other in order to give it to a master. Instead, here it is fear of an already sovereign master. Our collective fear of he that wieldeth this force causes us to establish that is our sovereign by force. Now, I would have it to you that the foundations of South Africa's legal order come precisely through this. This demarcation of death and dying is not a recent thing, but it was established precisely at the time of the arrival of Van Riebeeck. I won't read directly from the texts except for one, but you know, it's worth visiting that Van Riebeeck indeed did invoke conquest in a just war in order to defend his acquisition of territory in South Africa. The Khoisan sent a delegation to negotiate about his encroachment on land, and his answer to them was, I have conquered you in a defensive war, and the land is now mine, and I have a right to impose this rule here. Okay? Conquest itself, in a nutshell, is sometimes oversimplified in regular discussion, and people simply understand it as a defeat. Conquest in the theory of international law consists of two components. One, the conqueror gains through conquest, through this victory in war, supposedly title to the territory of those who are defeated. So, the land question. But the land question is also the sea question, it's the river question, it's the minerals question. I see people have forgotten about this and think we are talking about urban dwelling land or farming land. We're talking about the basis on which it was that some fools were able to sell the wealth of our great ancestors to Anglo-American. Okay? The point is that that belongs to us. And the way in which they gained the right to sell with that which belongs to us was through the use of conquest. Okay? The right of conquest also entitles not only to the title to territory, but sovereignty over the inhabitants of that territory. So this we might describe as the right to make law. Once I've beaten you, I both own your land and I have the right to instruct you, and you must obey on the basis of this force. Of course, you remember me telling you that Hobbes says it is authority, it is force, and not truth that maketh law, right? This is the point. I beat you, now you must obey me. But Hobbes says something very interesting, and I'll quote him here, in describing that conquest is not simply the defeat of the other. Conquest is a relation of domination that sustains after the defeat, when the defeated lives at the pains of death, at the mercy of their master. So these are the words he uses. He that is slain is overcome, but not conquered. He that is taken and put into prisons or chains is not conquered, but he that upon the promise of obedience hath his life and liberty allowed him is then conquered and a subject, and not before. You understand? It isn't simply being defeated. A genocide does not establish conquest, the imprisonment of one's political enemies. It is once they accept that their superior force entitles the other one to rule over them and accept their life in exchange for this, that they are conquered. Now, if you go to the history and theory of slavery, you see that Aristotle distinguishes between natural slaves and those born out of conquest. The origins of slavery, I just don't have time, are out of this relation of conquest in the same way as that of Van Riebeeck's, dominion. I will now quote from the last thing and then close up and leave to my elder comrade, Lwazi. Now, what I want you to understand is that whites understood very well that the establishment of their dominion, their power in South Africa, was based on the right of conquest. This is not a conspiracy theory. You could study the documents and legal history. It comes up in various places. But if you doubt it, and when I say whites, I say abamhlophe of the PAC, not amabhunu of the ANC, okay? Because if you study the negotiation strategies of the liberals, the supposed good whites, which Biko told us about, and the Marxists, in the form of Joe Slovo's own agitations inside the Congress, and the conservatives, you get exactly the same thing at the negotiation table. Helen Zille makes it very clear in an essay written in 2006 called Liberalism and Its Blind Spots. She says a number of very interesting things which are important for us today. One, she says, the liberals, though small in their number, were far more intellectually prepared for the negotiations than the ANC. And indeed, she's right. If you study constitutional theory and history of liberal organizations, especially in after 76, you see multiple conferences and compendia making proposals for the constitutional future of South Africa. But she says, here are our accomplishments. One, we were able to win a liberal constitution. She says, our constitution, not yours. Well, some of you. Number two, she says, our objective was this. So one, she says, we managed to bring an end to parliamentary sovereignty and establish constitutional supremacy. This she calls the biggest accomplishment of the liberals. Now remember this question of sovereignty and conquest. How was sovereignty established in South Africa by Van Riebeeck and Milner's people? So she says, effectively, we were able to retain that sovereignty by ridding Parliament of its capacity to make law which is binding and replace it with a supreme constitution. Helen Zille doesn't go far enough. If you study the conservatives, she's supposed to be one of the good whites. If you study the conservatives, there's an article published in 1993 by Annette Strauss, a historian who was at the University of the Free State at the time, called South Africa's 1992 referendum. I'm sure you've all heard whites speaking about how they voted to end apartheid in 1992, right? You've heard this. So it studies that process of the referendum, and it makes some interesting claims. It says that both the National Party as well as the multinational corporations in South Africa instructed, advised, and held workshops to ask white people to vote yes, to give the National Party a strong mandate at negotiating with the ANC. They said, even in the pages of the Rapport newspaper, that if they didn't do this, then, white domination would be dead forever. But one of the things that they say is that they'll be able to, if given this strong mandate, produce a supreme constitution and bring an end to the sovereignty of Parliament, so that no matter how many Bantus go to Parliament, they will never be able to make law of consequence, okay? Because there will be a superior master that de Klerk will leave them as his parting gift, which will preside on them regardless of what. So you might understand this as the effective end or suspension of popular sovereignty. And that this will be agreed to before any future election. That its foundational provisions will be accepted before any future election. So, democratic constitution, I don't know. But my parting quotation comes from what is sometimes called the oldest liberation movement on the continent. I'm sure you've heard this before. This is a petition, 1914, written to King George V, shortly after the occasion of the promulgation of the Native Land Act. Here, I want you to remember what I said. Conquest consisteth, 1, defeat, right? 2, on the basis of defeat, the assertion of the title to territory. 3, on the basis of that defeat, the assertion of sovereignty over those who have been defeated on that territory, okay? Remember, this is what is conquest. Now here the learned lawyers of our brother write, "We are your Majesty's loyal and humble subjects." This is to King George V, "who have always been loyal to your Majesty's throne and person, and still desire to continue being loyal to your Majesty's throne and person." Okay? That the petitioners, in their capacity as representatives of the South African Native National Congress, which is again the representative body of the natives of the Union of South Africa, most humbly approach your Majesty as their king, their father, and their protector, and say that the petitioners are descendants of a race which, when their forebears were conquered by your Majesty's might, and their land taken from them, their laws and customs mangled, and their military and other institutions brought to naught, loyally and cheerfully submitted to your Majesty's sway, in the belief that they would be allowed to possess their land as British subjects and given the full benefits of British rule like other British subjects. These are the British subjects for whom sovereignty was established by institution. They don't use, you remember, you know, that the petitioners say that when their forebears submitted themselves to the rule of the British government and paid homage to them, they fully accepted the sovereignty of Great Britain and no other. They fully believed that their land would be reserved for them and that they would have the full right of British subjects, especially with regards to possession of their land and the right incident thereto. I close it here. Thank you.